Well, nothing looks wrong here. Say hopped off of the ladder, dusting off her gloves as she left the shadows of the warehouse. A line of men silently followed her out into the street where several better-dressed men awaited her with expressions of grave concern. Men tended to go out of their way to chat with her, but these men carried themselves as if someone had just died, or was about to. One of them stepped forward, almost managing not to wring the cap in his hands as he spoke. "Is everything to your satisfaction, miss?" "Yup," Say smiled brightly. "Thanks, Mr. Paulson." The men didn't smile back. If anything, they looked like they were a hair away from bolting. Their behavior was starting to get annoying. The same men lined up in front of her were kneeling with their faces to the floor when she stepped out of the gate to re-roble. She was used to men neither treating her nice because she was a cute little girl or underestimating her for the same reason. It was usually a mix of both, but all she got from these ones was silence. Silence and fear. They were supposed to be officers of an organization that ruled the underground of Riestais. The man who spoke for them, Prian Paulson, was supposed to be an executive while the others were high-ranking officers. They didn't act like it, however. They didn't eat like it, either. All of them were so pale and skinny that she wondered if they were sick. She boarded the carriage and 3 of the men got in with her. They all squished themselves into the opposite seat. The man closing the door checked 4 times to make sure he didn't hit her with it even though she was nowhere close. "Will the ship be sailing today?" Say asked. "Yes, Miss Say," Mr. Paulson tensed before answering. "The captain said that the weather will be ideal for the voyage. We've also taken the liberty of reserving a table at the city's finest restaurant for dinner before you depart." The tone of his voice didn't match his words at all. Instead of inviting her to a fancy dinner, it sounded as if he was apologizing for something instead. Say frowned slightly, wondering what was wrong. "I'm sorry." Say started as Lloyd, the man to the right of Mr. Paulson, cried and lowered his head between his knees. "I'm sorry." Lloyd's head of blonde hair shook as he spoke. "It wasn't me. It wasn't my idea. I said that. Hey." Mr. Paulson shook his shoulder. "Get a grip." "Is something the matter?" Say asked. The 3 men froze, turning even paler than before. "It's nothing, Miss Say," Mr. Paulson answered. "About dinner." "I would be most delighted to join you," Say smiled. "Join?" Gregory, the man to Mr. Paulson's left, looked like he wanted to jump out of the window. They said it was the finest restaurant in the city. Did they not want to eat with her? Was it because she was still growing up? She bet that they would be competing for her attention if she were 4 or 5 years older. As it was, they refused to even share the same seat. The wagon jostled them slightly as it rolled up the cobblestone road to their destination, stopping in front of a lighthouse on a cliff overlooking the harbor. Near the base of the lighthouse was the restaurant, sporting the somewhat unimaginative name of the lighthouse. Maybe its location simply demanded it. As she disembarked, Say's hand went to the felt cap on her head, holding it in place against a sudden gust from the sea. 2 of the men stepped in front of her in an attempt to shield her from the wind, which also happened to block the view of the sunset. Say suppressed a sigh, trying her best to look dignified despite how silly her company was behaving. A pair of men from the restaurant staff bowed before opening the establishment's door for them. A receptionist in a nice suit offered them a warm smile as they stepped onto polished cedar floorboards. His olive gaze, however, turned slightly confused as it went back and forth between Say and her companions. Not that she could blame him. Normally, people would address men first in Riestais, but her companions looked so out of sorts that the receptionist couldn't tell who was in the lead. Say stopped a few meters away from the counter so Mr. Paulson could step clearly ahead of her. "Welcome to the lighthouse," the man lowered his head. "We've been expecting you, sir." Men and women alike sent surreptitious glances in their direction as they were led through the candle-lit main dining room to a private chamber overlooking the sea. Say compared herself to the restaurant's other patrons in return. She wore a frilly white blouse under a midnight blue coat that covered her hips, but she was also wearing a pair of matching pants. All of the women present, on the other hand, were wearing long, fancy dresses with snug corsets and complex updos, emulating the court fashion of Riestais. The eyes of the diners eventually fell upon the lute slung over Say's shoulder, and it was then that their judgmental gazes finally left her, satisfied. "All right, I pass." It was strange for a girl to be wearing pants in a high-class establishment like this, but it was a different story if she was a bard. She had gone from being a crude interloper to a pleasing accompaniment to their evening. Once they arrived at their private chamber and the door whispered shut, Say took a seat in the corner of the room. She lightly plucked the strings of her lute, cocking an ear to gauge how much sound was being absorbed by the walls. "Oh, so you can really play that, Miss Say? Do you have any requests, Mr. Paulson?" Say asked. No, I wouldn't dare. These people are really..." Rather than vent her annoyance at her hosts, Say softly strummed a tune of her own choosing. It was the soothing melody of a piece called Winter's Crown. The song had mysteriously appeared less than a year ago and steadily gained in popularity around the Azalisia Mountains. She didn't add her voice to the tune, fearing it would be too much. Eventually, the men relaxed enough to reach for their beverages. "So," Say asked, "how have things been going here?" "There's no end to the headaches, Miss Say," Mr. Paulson said. "They're supposed to be nobles, but those idiots sure don't act like them." It was a very different answer from what she had received shortly after arriving. Back then, everything was fine and under control and there was absolutely nothing to worry about. "Has anything particularly troublesome happened?" "It ain't any one thing," Mr. Paulson sighed after downing the rest of his drink. "Those brats have all sorts of ideas. They're all scions of minor, independent houses, but they act as if they're members of the great nobles. No, it's worse than that, they act like they think they're the bloody emperor." "No kidding," Gregory shook his head. "Just their expenses for clothing ran us out of money this spring." "You think you have it bad now?" Lloyd grumbled. "Just wait till summer taxes." As one, the men sitting at the table groaned. "What happened last year?" Say asked. "What didn't happen?" Mr. Paulson snorted as he poured himself another drink. "The security division was strapped. Almost none of those brats owed the men to collect taxes. They released them, thinking that they could be hired back just for each tax season as if they thought that was the only thing that they did. Of course, the clerks and magistrates found jobs elsewhere in the kingdom or left for the empire." Then, Lloyd picked up the topic as Mr. Paulson started draining his glass. "Half of them decided to raise taxes without any warning once we started doing their work for them. One girl I had to deal with thought that she could tax us. It was her right, she said. If Zero was still around, he'd have punched her pretty little head off." "Wasn't there the one guy that tried to use the men we lent him to clear out the demi-human tribes along his border?" Gregory asked. "There was," Mr. Paulson nodded. "He tried enticing them with knighthoods using the land that he wanted them to conquer. Who would want to be under that fool?" "The smuggling division's running out of drugs and liquor," Lloyd said. "We were supposed to make money with it, and now we're in the red. I never imagined you could lose money running contraband." Say listened quietly as they took turns ranting, nudging them along when she had heard enough about a topic. It was no wonder that the Sorceress Kingdom wasn't making any headway in Ria's ties. Never mind the history between the two countries, the people they were working with were utterly incompetent. The nobles that they were using were incompetent. Their handlers were incompetent. The three men in front of her complaining about the incompetence of the people that they were responsible for were themselves incompetent. She wondered how far the web of incompetence went. "What did our superior have to say about all of this?" Say asked. The men jerked as if doused with ice water. Their eyes went from their empty plates to their empty glasses before going to Say. They didn't seem to understand what she had done to them, instead blaming the liquor for loosening their tongues. "Perhaps you could be so kind as to inform Her Excellency," Lloyd said hopefully. "I'm going in the opposite direction," Say reminded them. "We still have everything under control," Mr. Paulson said. "There's no need to bother Her Excellency." "She must be a busy person," Gregory nodded. With all of the resources at Lady Albedo's disposal, Say doubted that she didn't know what was going on. They were doing Ria's ties a giant favor by collecting all of the notable incompetence in the country for disposal. Maybe the whole organization they were working with was included in that. Every day that they delayed what they were supposed to report brought them another step closer to the chopping block. "I hope they get purged. I'd rather not work with people like them in the future." Mrs. Lynham taught her that incompetent allies were worse than any enemy. These guys were just thugs with some power who only looked out for themselves. The Sorceress Kingdom was better off without people like that. They didn't linger for much longer as Say's ship was going out with the tide. The four of them rode in silence as the carriage brought them to the southernmost pier of the harbor. A group of sun-baked sailors played dice at the base of the pier. They rose to their feet and folded their arms, forming a wall of muscles that barred the way to their ship as the carriage rolled to a stop before them. "Those guys don't look very happy to see us," Say noted. "Sailors are a rough bunch, Miss Say," Lloyd said. Please don't hold us responsible for any rough treatment on their part." Say disembarked from the carriage, slinging the small sack with her belongings over her right shoulder while holding her lute in her left hand. A broad man with arms as thick as her body walked up the pier to meet them. As he came closer, Say noticed the pointed ears of a half-elf. "Lloyd," he spat, "don't tell me that this is your inspector." If Mr. Paulson, Gregory, and Lloyd had fainted right then and there, Say wouldn't have been surprised. The big man sneered at their reaction. "Well, whatever," he said. "It's not as if I have anything to hide. Hey, someone carry the young Miss bag." One of the sailors stepped forward. He frowned and tested the weight of Say's bag after she placed it into his arms. Say turned and smiled at her three hosts. "Thanks for dinner," she said. "Our pleasure, Miss Say." Mr. Paulson bobbed his head. "So we're clear, right? Nothing bad to report?" "Nope," Say replied. "It must be a problem on the other end." Beside Mr. Paulson, Lloyd made a heretical gesture. Say narrowed his eyes at him and he fell on his butt with a whimper. "Anyway," Say said, "I'm going now. Thanks for everything." The big man's boots thumped on the boardwalk as he accompanied Say to the ship. "Those are some hard men you were dealing with," he said. "At least I thought they were. Strong folk would run straight into the sea if they knew that they were after him. You do something?" "Not really." "Huh? Well, they looked like something was eating them from the inside out." She didn't know what their problem was. Mr. Paulson and his people weren't even supposed to be in Re-Roble. He had rushed to the port city from the capital just so he could deal with her personally, but all she was doing was counting sacks of grain. In the end, she couldn't decide whether they were just intimidated by girls or numbers bigger than 10. "Is the cargo already loaded?" Say asked as she looked up at the tall sails of the ship. "Yes, ma'am. 50 tons of grain bound for Banner in the Holy Kingdom. Those bastards didn't even introduce us. I'm Harold, Captain of Devin's Guile." "I'm Say. Pleased to meet you, Captain Harold." Since he had a human-sounding name, or at least not an elvish-sounding one, he had probably been raised by the human side of his family. A sailor pulled in the gangplank after they boarded the ship. It was unlike the wide, flat barges of the Draconic Kingdom with their square sails. "What kind of ship is this?" she asked. "A caravel," Captain Harold answered. "Never seen one before?" Say shook her head. "She's a true blue water vessel," the captain told her. "Small, but faster and more agile than most." "How long will the trip take?" "It's an easy run. Banner is 200 kilometers straight downwind of Re-Roble, so we'll arrive before dawn." That was fast. A regular wagon would take a week and a half to reach the northern gate of the Great Wall of Roble in perfect weather. The ship, despite being described as small, carried 50 times more than a horse-drawn wagon, too. "Will it be dangerous?" Say asked. "Nearly every square kilometer of the shelf from Argland to the Crusader States is the domain of one sea dragon or another, and they've been keeping the peace since their numbers returned to normal. Trade on the Gyre brings them far more wealth and prestige than raiding, you see. There are occasionally monsters that pop up near the coast, but that sort of thing is usually reserved for the northbound route in this part of the world." "Why would the south and north route be different?" "Because it's a gyre?" The captain furrowed his brow. "Jem, think of a gyre as the wind going in big circles over the ocean. In the north on this side of the continent, the wind blows south along the coast. That makes going south easy and safe as it takes you over the rich fisheries and reefs that the sea dragons rule over. The fastest way to get back north, however, is to let the wind take you far out to sea. Ships trim their sails to head northwest until the turn of the winds takes them back to their destination on the coast." When they climbed up onto the caravel's poop deck, Say found a row of 3 men awaiting them. The captain gestured to each as he introduced them to Say. "Gentlemen, this Miss Say, the inspector they were talking about. Say, this is the quartermaster, Swed, the cook, Kazuma, and the druid, Aroso." "I didn't know ships had druids," Say said. "Every proper ocean-going ship has a druid. Well, I guess ships from places like the Holy Kingdom employ clerics." Divine casters are essential for long-distance travel. The largest galleons can have up to a dozen. They serve as the ship's doctor and navigator. They can conjure up food and wind if required. They're handy in a fight, too. We'd be walking around with peg legs, hand hooks and eye patches if they weren't around. What happened to the route being safe? I see, their names aren't from around here. Are they from another part of the world? That's right, Captain Harold nodded. Then joined the crew at different ports along the coast. Most of them are from south of the equator, the point where the sun starts traveling across the northern sky instead of the south like it does here. Arg. She wanted to see that. It sounded so fantastical. Say wanted to hear all of their stories, too, but she wouldn't be on board for long. Interestingly, they were all humans or close to it. That meant the story that humans were almost extinct was a lie and they actually lived all over the place. She wondered what the point of telling such a story was when it was so easy to disprove. I hope you don't mind if I ask your crew questions about the Holy Kingdom, Say said. I'd like to know what to expect when we arrive. It won't be a problem once we're out of port and underway, the captain told her. You should be able to tell when it's fine to talk to 'em. What about that thing about women and ships? Women and ships? Ships don't allow women on board if their voyage takes them out to sea on long voyages. Unless the crew's all women, then it's men that aren't allowed. Our trip's less than half a day, so there's no problem. She had never heard any tales about ships crewed by women before. Everything she had heard and studied always filled them with men. Captain Harold started barking orders to his crew. Say went to sit on a barrel near the rear mast, watching the ship come alive as it drifted out of port. Swed started to sing. The rest of the crew joined in every other line. Farewell and good riddance, to the whores of old Robel. Breathe deep of the cold, of the winds of the gyre. It's 36 leagues to the girls of Kalintia. And we'll cut through the deep till we're warmed by their fires. Say's heels thumped against the barrel in time with the tune as it went from stanza to stanza. The men weren't great singers, plus they all sang in different languages, but she saw that the song had a way of coordinating everybody as they worked together to sail the ship. She took up her lute and strummed along softly, noting that the sailors took turns singing lines that were improvised according to their location. At least half of those improvised lines had to do with women. Still, she appreciated the song for what it was, a common bond that everyone in the crew shared regardless of their home, language or even race. She committed the tune to memory while she wondered about all the places where the song might be sung. It was well known that the world was far, far larger than the little bit around D. Ranthal, but information about far-off lands was rare. As Say understood it, their part of the world was a rather uninteresting backwater that only tended to draw merchants for its raw resources. It was also a place where merchants could dump old magic items or obsolete gadgets that weren't worth selling anywhere else. Stories from abroad were next to unheard of unless they involved things that everyone in the world knew about, like the 8 Greed Kings or the great nations in the center of the continent. Even then, there wasn't much. Someday, her work would bring her to distant places she had never even heard of. At least that's what everyone said. All she needed to do was keep working. It wasn't long before Robel disappeared beyond the horizon. The sails overhead billowed with the brisk winds from the north and the ship rocked as it broke through the waves. The song ceased and the activities on the deck changed, with much of the crew splitting up to tend to individual tasks. She looked up at Captain Harold as he made another round of the ship. Is it okay to talk now? Say asked. Sure is, the captain replied. I told you you'd know when you saw it. Say slid off of her barrel, coming to walk alongside the captain. The big man raised his eyebrow at her. You're part of the crew too, right? Say said. Captain Harold snorted. He continued his rounds, but he didn't tell her to go away. You wanted to know what Robley is like these days, he said. I don't care about much that happens inland, but from what I've seen of the coast, they're not doing well. I guess that's to be expected with the north being ruined and all. How is it compared to Riestais? Say asked. Well, it's hard to get as bad as Riestais, the captain answered. The main thing is how fast everything's happening. Every time we sail into Ban, it's like a portrait that looks worse whenever you turn away and look at it again. Is it dangerous? Again, not like Riestais is. The people are all under one overseer or another, and life under them is basically the same sort of slavery that you see elsewhere on the continent. Well, no, It's quite a bit worse. It's like a permanent apprenticeship that one has to sign up for in order to live. Now, I have a question for you, if you don't mind. What is it? The captain stopped along the railing on the port side, looking out at the distant coastline. Those fellows you were with had us sign a curious contract, he said. I'm more than happy to help with the grain deliveries, but we're only using half of our overall cargo capacity each week. We're also paid to not export anything from the Holy Kingdom, though it's not as if they have much to sell. The strangest part is that the contract prohibits us from delivering refugees to Riestais, even paying ones. Roblay has too many people while Riestais has too few. Wouldn't it help both sides if we carried refugees to places where they can find work? Say remained silent for a moment, reviewing her response. Most of the ships that would normally trade between Riestais and Roble had been kept from sailing to the Holy Kingdom by the Eight Fingers through one method or another. The Sorcerer's Kingdom needed Divinsgail to deliver their food aid, however, so the ship required additional rules. More relief is being organized, she said, so we'll use more cargo space eventually. As for exports and people, did you hear about Yaldabouth's attack on Riestais' capital? I heard a few things about it. There was some sort of magic item that was tied to his attack, Say told him. Some people even say that it might be a living item that can get around in mysterious ways. We want to keep any item like that from traveling north, as well as any destructive fiends that may still be hiding in the Holy Kingdom with human disguises. They have reasons to target the Sorcerer's Kingdom, after all. Captain Harold rubbed his short, curly beard as he listened to her words. At the end of them, he shook his head. That would have never crossed my mind, he said. I guess that's the difference between running a country and running a ship. It's just the little bit we can do, Say said. But it might already be too late. You mean that the fiends or the item, or both, might have escaped to the south instead? I don't know much about the rest of the world, but I wouldn't be surprised if someone like Yaldabouth popped up somewhere else as a result. That's a worrying thought, Captain Harold sighed. But what if the fiends are still in the Holy Kingdom? Is that your real purpose there? You're too clever of a girl to just be counting sacks of grain. I'm here to investigate reports that suggest issues with the distribution of our grain, Say told him. We don't know if fiends or humans or rats are the cause. Please don't tell anyone about this. It might warn whoever's doing it and get me in trouble. Of course, the captain said. It's horrible to think that people might be suffering because of this. I'll be praying for your safety and success, Miss Say. Thank you, Captain Harold, Say smiled. Say wandered around the ship for the rest of the night, chatting with as many members of the crew as she could. Unlike the Eight Fingers members in Roble, they were more than happy to give her their attention whenever she sat down with them. She asked each one different questions, but their questions always revolved around a handful of the same topics. This was in no small part due to her leading the discussion in that direction. By doing so, she was able to sow plenty of the seeds that Lord Demiurge had requested for her to spread around whenever the opportunity arose. The first bunch of seeds had to do with Yaldabouth. She guessed that the Sorcerer's Kingdom was trying to spread awareness of the fiend before he struck again. The second bunch of seeds were something like a test of loyalty to see how far Divinsgail and its crew could be trusted. Captain Harold felt like a nice guy, so she hoped that they would pass. As promised, the lighthouse of Ban, the port town north of Kalinshire, came into view well before dawn. Say sat down on her barrel by the rear mast again to get out of the way of the crew. While she watched them make their preparations, a voice sounded in her head. Say. She almost raised a hand to her ear. Lord Demiurge? Indeed. Due to favorable developments, we will be moving Phase 2 forward by 3 steps. What about the investigation? You should have some time yet before needing to reach your assigned target. Feel free to find out what you can along the way. Understood. Oh, I planted those seeds amongst the crew of Divinsgail. Excellent. You have once again proven your usefulness. Say could hear Lord Demiurge's smile over the message spell. She decided to warn him about the behavior she had observed in Roble, just in case. Also, those Eight Fingers guys suck. They think that problems just go away if you ignore them, and I don't know how many they're hiding. It feels like they only got as far as they did in Riestais because it's Riestais. Yes, well, it goes to show the dire state of the country when the Eight Fingers is the best option available. Fret not, however, The Prime Minister has given her assurances that everything is under control. I look forward to your performance in the Holy Kingdom, say. If things go well, Roble shall be reborn into something more fresh and dynamic. The message spell ended. Say leaned back on the mast, hugging her knee as she watched the lights of Ban's harbor slowly grow closer. It was time to return the heretics to the fold. The God of Justice would reign over them once again. That's a lot of soldiers, Say said. Aye, it is, Captain Harold replied. In the darkness before dawn, Divinsgal slowly coasted into Ban's modest harbor. Say wrinkled her nose at the odors of the wharf, but they were a far lesser concern relative to the sight that revealed itself as they closed with the piers of the port. Soldiers loitered all over the waterfront, far more than the port town should have had. As soon as they noticed, the caravel's crew took turns arming themselves, slipping sheathed cutlasses into their sashes and gripping bucklers in their fists. Say borrowed the captain's cabin to change into a less flashy outfit. By the time she came out again, soldiers were gathering on the pier. Captain Harold stood at the port railing, nursing some sort of magic item in his hand. It looked like a thick wand, or maybe a short club. A half-dozen more were holstered in his bandoliers. What's that? Say asked. This? The captain turned the item in his hand. It's a blunderbuss. A type of gun. Oh. It was different from the one that Miss Delta carried around. Does it work differently than other guns? Say asked. It does, Captain Harold nodded. Unlike other guns that draw the user's mana as your firearm, blunderbusses only hold one charge per barrel. But you can pre-charge them and have a bunch at once like me. It's a good compromise for those who don't have large mana pools. A single shot can blast open a man's chest from 10 meters, so it's ideal for exchanges between ships just before boarding. Will it scare away the soldiers? The captain snorted. Probably not. The only people that know what guns are in these parts are those who've sailed far down the coast. The average soldier in Roble's army is just about as ignorant as any other landlubber, any other farmer or city dweller around here. A man in polished plate armor rode his horse to the end of the pier. He kicked a dockworker aside to make room for himself and called out to Divinsgal as it closed with its berth. Identi oof. A mooring line hit the man square in the breastplate. He tumbled off his horse, rolling twice before falling into the water. Lord Reynaldo. Someone get a rope. The dockworker returned to retrieve the line and moved to secure the ship while the soldiers around him shouted and milled about. Uppity little bitch, Captain Harold muttered. There's your opening, Miss Say. Thanks. Say grinned. Say concealed her presence before vaulting over the railing and slipping into the chaos. She probably wasn't stealthy enough to avoid detection by anyone who had watched her disembark, so she kept going as quickly as she could, sidling between soldiers and ducking under horses. Once she reached the buildings lining the wharf, she ran into the shadows of a narrow alley and climbed up onto the rooftops. What to do now? Her original plan was to earn room and board in town by performing at an alehouse or restaurant. She would stay for several days, gleaning information as she worked and developed a picture of what was going on. With so many soldiers in the port, however, all available accommodations were probably taken by army officers and it probably wasn't a good idea to stick around for as long as she wanted to. Why were there so many soldiers here, anyway? Say padded over the red clay tiles of the rooftops, examining her surroundings before dropping back down and dirtying herself up a bit. At the end of the alley, she discovered that a ring of spectators had formed around Captain Harold, who stood cross-armed in front of the pier leading to his ship as two uniformed men argued in front of him. One was adorned in an officer's tabard, but he had the telltale handsomeness of Roble's aristocrats. A squad of soldiers stood behind him. Say couldn't tell if they were retainers in uniform or just army regulars. Standing alone opposite the officer stood a middle-aged man in the uniform of a clerk. You can't just requisition any cargo that comes into port. The man in the clerk's uniform said, this doesn't even make any sense. If the Royal Army has been deployed, then it should have its own supply lines. Is the army going to take our food away? Say asked. The two men she had stuck her head out between glanced down at her before one of them answered. I don't know, he said. Prices are bad enough with the new shipyard sucking up everything. Prices? Why were there prices for grain delivered as charity? She couldn't ask for clarification without marking herself as an outsider, however. We do have our own supply lines, the army officer said. That's why we're requisitioning this cargo. Huh? The clerks, and Say's confusion was echoed by dozens of other spectators. A sigh filled the air as the officer looked around him as if everyone was an idiot. We have been charged by His Divine Grace to conquer the wildlands north of the wall. An army only moves as quickly as its supply lines. Our country needs this campaign to succeed. The sooner victory comes, the sooner sorely needed resources can start flowing into our markets. We can speed our progress by having our troops carry the port supplies while those supplies are, in turn, replenished by the wagons lagging behind us. A low murmur rose around the clearing. Did he say that the army would take all of the town's supplies? This is unreasonable, the clerk said. What do you expect us to eat while we wait for your wagons? And those supplies aren't just for the port, they're for the labor camp raising the shipyards, too. It isn't as if you're going through all of your supplies in a single day. The officer raised his arms in a shrug and shook his head. We will leave you with enough to last until tomorrow morning. I assure you that our supply wagons will arrive just in time. This is too reckless, the clerk said amidst the rising concern of the crowd. I demand to speak with your commanding officer. Marquis Bodipo is with the center wing of the army at the wall. Everyone immediately hushed. The officer's lips turned up into a triumphant smile. As with other places, merely mentioning a High Lord was enough to shut most people up. Marquis Bodipo. The clerk frowned. That's impossible. This isn't something he'd do. Captain Harold, could you do me a favor and sail me to the North Gate? That's not against the terms of your contract, right? The officer raised his hand. His soldiers drew their sidearms, filling the air with a ring of steel. Cries of panic rose from the spectators and people shoved against one another as they tried to get away. This is an order, the officer was no longer smiling, not a request. Additionally, we'll be taking that ship in the port to help move supplies to the front. Ho! Captain Harold uncrossed his massive arms. Is that so? As the captain had predicted, the officer seemed unimpressed. Say leaned forward expectantly, waiting for a hole to appear in his chest. The Holy Kingdom has a legal right to repurpose any ships moored in its ports in times of war, the officer said. You are in no position to resist our righteous cause. I guess not, Captain Harold shrugged. But our contractor may take issue with what you're doing. Your contractor? The officer scoffed, as if a measly merchant can do anything against a country. What remained of the crowd fell deathly silent. The soldiers brandishing their arms looked around themselves nervously. The Sorceress Kingdom holds a contract with Divinskyle to deliver its grain, the clerk informed them. In the end, the officer took supplies, but not the ship. Say turned away from the scene, sighing in disappointment. I wonder if that's what's happening to the grain. That probably wasn't right. The confrontation seemed to be a new issue. It did give hints about what happened to the previous shipments, however. The grain went to help feed the port and the laborers constructing a new shipyard somewhere nearby. It seemed like a good idea. The last time she was in the Holy Kingdom, they barely had any ships left. Building more would help them bring in stuff that they needed from elsewhere. Say wandered around the town as the skies grew lighter, watching the townsfolk go about their daily routines. Her wandering eventually brought her to the market square, where she recoiled in horror at the price of everything. I need to get some food. It was already so expensive, far more expensive than she remembered. She dove into a crowd of similarly minded people, fighting to get to the storefront of one of the bakeries facing the square. By the time she made it to the counter, the price of bread had gone up by half a silver. After stuffing several rolls into her bag, she went to buy some dried fish and preserves. As with the bakery, she found people rushing to stockpile food in the face of the impending shortage. The officer's plan was already doomed to fail. It would take a while for the soldiers to make off with the town's supplies, so she wondered if the plan would change. She didn't want to be around if it didn't. A set of liveried men escorting a loaded wagon through the streets caught her attention. She tailed them to the town's western gate, where they joined 20 other wagons escorted by men in the same colors. A mix of men and women were traveling with the caravan, so Say went to join them. She fell into step with a woman walking near the rear of the group. Is this caravan going to the shipyard? Say asked. It is, the woman answered. You're a bit young to be working there, though. Unless. The woman's words trailed off and her lips pressed into a thin line. Her look of sympathy combined with frustrated resignation finished the sentence for her. A few moments passed before she let out a weak, self-deprecating laugh. "Ah, who am I to say anything?" she said. "I'm going for the same reason. Maybe the gods stuck us together to keep our spirits up." "Why did you decide to go today?" "Why else?" The woman looked over her shoulder. "You must have seen what happened back there. I was already barely surviving on scraps and I didn't want any debts, so I just gave up." "What did you do before?" Say glanced over the woman's appearance. She was dressed in town fashion and, like many of the townsfolk, her garb hung loosely over her frame. A sack like Say's was slung over her shoulder and the only other visible belonging was the dagger in her belt. "I made my living mending nets and sails for Ban's fishing fleet," the woman said. "Then the war came and those damned demi-humans destroyed the fleet in a single night raid. I thank the gods that the war's over, but that doesn't mean life's just back to the way it was before. There's only been enough time to build small rowboats to fish with and not enough work for people like me." The seamstress let out a sigh and gave Say an apologetic look. "Sorry," she said. "I'm just ranting. I know I'm not the only one having troubles because of all this." "How come you didn't go to the shipyard before this?" Say asked. "If they're going to build new ships, they're going to need sails and nets for them, right? You're not from around here, are you?" "I came from a farm town further inland," Say replied. "Things must be getting bad if you're coming all the way out here." "I'm not sure. People say that things will get better and we just have to stick it out for a bit longer, but the bit longer keeps getting longer and longer. I heard about the shipyard, so I left while I could still afford to." Another woman fell back to walk with them. She was probably around 20, but the poor condition of her pale skin and blonde hair made her look much older. "I guess that's what it all boils down to," she stretched and yawned. "Honestly, we're making the best choice. All of my friends left town to do the same thing back when the Holy King commissioned the shipyard, but I was too stubborn to give in. Now, food is worth more than coin and I look like this. I hope the men left over still have teeth." Within a minute, all of the women following the caravan had formed a group around Say. From their chatter, it sounded like they were all going to the shipyard with the same idea. There was no living to be made in their old jobs anymore, so they were going to the labor camp to become wives so they could at least survive. Say knew that the Holy Kingdom was in trouble from her first visit, but it was crazy how quickly things were deteriorating. The stuff that she did to support Liam and herself during their previous assignment probably wouldn't work so well anymore. "So, how come the people overseeing the labor camp won't let us work normally?" Say asked. "It's because they're nobles from down south, isn't it?" One woman said. "They brought in their own people. All of us in the north are just menial laborers to them." Say nodded thoughtfully. It made sense, in hindsight. Though Riastais, the Haruth, and the Holy Kingdom were ruled by different types of sovereigns, they mostly worked the same way. Outside of religion, the fabric of society was woven out of contracts, patronage, and history. In the Holy Kingdom's case, the southern aristocrats who came to help run things in the north favored their own people over the ones that they were managing in the north. The longer a tenant's relationship with their landlord was, the more trustworthy they were considered to be. A history of trust was the most valuable currency and factored heavily into decision-making. Of course, it wasn't just the nobles who thought that way, nearly everyone did. The only people who didn't think that way were the tiny minority who were born and raised in the cities, which were directly under the Holy King. Even so, urban society simply replaced the nobility with the guilds that each citizen was affiliated with, ending up with a similar dynamic. With the southern Holy Kingdom's population mostly untouched by the war, they would have plenty of hopeful spares to bring in. Moreover, it was expected that they would be favored over the citizens of the north by both the presiding house and the spares family. Say doubted that anyone would have given the decision a second thought, and those decisions left the citizens of the north last in line when it came to securing tenancies, receiving licenses, and being granted various legal rights. "What about you?" the woman Say had first walked up to asked. "What did you do before all of this?" "I was training to become a bard," Say answered. "But people don't have money to spare for bards anymore." "A bard? No wonder you're so pretty. You'll have no problem becoming the mistress of someone rich and powerful. You might even be able to snag the overseer. Or maybe a young knight," a woman on her left grinned. "With looks like that, you could pick out your type." Say smiled as the conversation carried on without her, and the women spent their time on the road trying to figure out how to improve their looks with the limited means available to them. She had no intention of becoming a wife, but she didn't want to ruin the mood. The group of women had little to be happy about, and they were just using what they thought were her circumstances to embark on their own little fantasies. Their caravan passed through several fishing villages on its way along the windy coastal road. As expected, the villages were in far better condition than the town. They ate first and exported the rest, after all. The people in charge of them probably saw to it that they didn't want for anything that affected their production. The shipyard, or, rather, the shipyard's labor camp, came into view early in the afternoon. Tents covered the fields along the gentle slope that led to the rocky coastline. Fluttering banners alternated between the flag of the Holy Kingdom and a house that she was unfamiliar with. "Which house is that?" Say looked up as they crossed into the camp. "The banners are different from the ones over the villages." I think they said it was Randall's," Say and the other women started as the stern voice of a man-at-arms came from the side. "And don't you forget it. You, women, follow me." Say exchanged looks with a few people in her group before they followed the man up a muddy track through the tents. Lingering gazes from the laborers around the cook fires tracked them as they passed. Way too many of them rested on Say. "Hello? I'm 11. She knew that bards were just naturally attractive, and she was starting to become more womanly no matter what Liam said to the contrary, but she was still nowhere close to looking like an adult. The attention she received wasn't that much of a bother to her in the Draconic Kingdom, but that was because she knew that the people in the Draconic Kingdom had an actual reason for getting together at a young age. They also knew their limits. Say wasn't sure if these men did. The other women in the group didn't seem to notice, or at least they pretended not to. Most of them looked like they were trying to see what was in the cookpots or silently strategizing as they took in the details of the camp. As they continued up the slope, their path eventually firmed and dried up. Their surroundings similarly improved, and the men held themselves differently from the ones below. A pair of sentries armed with spears stopped them at the opening of a fenced-off area. "Regina's still on her way down," one of them said. "We can't stick 'em in the tent?" "The tent guards are coming down with her." "What tent?" a woman near the front asked. A sentry pointed loosely behind him in the direction of a white tent. "That one," he said. "There's a bath and some, woman stuff to pretty yourself up with. You get a clean shift, as well." "In the meantime," the other sentry added, "it don't hurt to let the boys take a look at you while you wait." Several men had already gathered and more were on the way. Say watched bemusedly as the women shrunk away. Some tried to hide behind other women while others turned around. Whether they didn't like the attention at all or just didn't want to be seen before they were ready, Say couldn't tell. Then, she caught her right hand coming up to pull her hair over her ear and wanted to punch herself. A few minutes later, the crowd parted to reveal a woman with fiery curls dressed from head to toe in finery. Behind her came a column of maids. Half of them needed a shave and all of them looked like they could break a grown man in half. The woman in finery tapped the end of a long pipe in the palm of her hand as she looked down at the newly arrived women. "I am Regina," she told them in a stern voice. "If you wish to survive here, remember that you answer to me." Almost simultaneously, the women spread their skirts and lowered their heads in a variety of awkward curtsies. "Yes, Lady Regina." Say turned away and snuck off. Nope. Just from those few seconds, she knew it was a bad idea to stay. Both physically and mentally, Lady Regina placed herself high above the other women. She was likely to be aggressive about defending her position of dominance and would see Say as a threat no matter what. Say wanted to look around the important parts of the camp for a bit to learn what she could, but she also didn't want to be stripped naked and thrown to the men in the mud below so she could know her place. The unfavorable lighting of the afternoon severely limited Say's ability to sneak around, so she decided to just leave. A girl traveling alone in the country would probably raise unwanted attention, however, so she went to wait at the nearest village. Along the way, she changed back into her bard outfit and pulled out her loot. After some thought, she decided to equip several magic items, including her dark vision necklace and a pair of gloves that increased her dexterity. This was in addition to her belt, which increased her strength, a pair of boots that made her more stealthy, a mantle that increased her resistance, and a nondescript brooch that granted its wearer an endure elements effect. Then, she took off a glove and slipped on her lesser ring of protection. In all, they were accessories that one would expect a successful wandering bard to wear. Say had, in fact, paid for everything herself through her performance earnings. She still hadn't decided what sort of bard she wanted to be, so she didn't have any weapons or armor yet. Not that they would help her on her current assignment. She chatted with the villagers to learn what she could before a caravan appeared from the direction of the labor camp. Its escort paid her little mind as she waved at the man sitting beside the front driver. "Where to?" she asked. "Kalinsha," the man answered. "Need a ride?" "If you don't mind." The man reached out as the wagon rolled by, pulling her up to sit beside him. Since the wagon was loaded with dried fish, Say put her pack on the vehicle's footrest. She removed her boots, wiggling her toes with a relieved sigh. "Thank you so much," Say smiled. "I've been walking all day. We haven't seen a bard since near the beginning of the war. Where'd you come from?" "I arrived at Ban with Devinsgyle." Several of the escorts raised their eyebrows. "Devinsgyle," the man sitting beside her said. "They're a rough bunch. I hope nothing bad happened." Why did people keep saying that? The crew was rough-spoken, but they were all nice to her. "We sailed from Re-Robel, so it was a short voyage." A scratching sound came from beside her as the man rubbed the stubble of his jaw. "Re-Robel, eh? How are things up in Riastais these days?" "Normal, for Riastais." "Darn," the man said. "They didn't lift a finger to help us with Yaldabouth, so I was hoping something would happen to them. Burn a bit, maybe. Is that too much to ask? Anyway, I'd like to think that a bard appearing from abroad is a sign of good things to come. I'm Bernardo, by the way, a merchant working for House Randalls." "I'm Say. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Bernardo. So what brings you here, if you don't mind my asking?" "I came to find out what's going on in the Holy Kingdom," Say replied. "There's barely any news about you guys in the north, so it's valuable information for all of the people that want to resume trade." A chuckle rose from Bernardo. "I like the way you think, Miss Say," he said. "We could use our trade links back, even if it's just Riastais. If you're here for what you say, you must have noticed the prices in Ban." "I did," Say frowned. "I thought I brought enough money to live here for a few weeks, but now I am not even sure if I can earn anything with my usual work. Actually, I heard something weird in Ban about the Sorceress Kingdom's free grain being sold for money. I couldn't make any sense out of it." "It's all about being equitable," Bernardo told her. "Equitable? As in fair?" "Aha. We're glad for the help, but only charging the cost of handling, processing, and distribution means that a handful of people get food on the cheap while everyone else suffers. Instead, we process the grain and sell the bread at market value. The relief from the grain comes in the form of lower demand for food, transport, and labor elsewhere, which in turn helps keep prices down. Get it?" Say clapped her hands in delight. "Wow, that's so smart. I know a little bit about markets, but you merchants really know your stuff. Did you come up with this yourself?" "Nah," Bernardo waved a hand. "It was the leaders assigned to manage the area around Ban. Under the leadership of His Divine Grace, the Holy Kingdom's become a place full of fresh new ideas. We just need to stick things out to fruition. The world will be shocked to see what's changed." Say reached down and pulled out her lute, pretending to tune its strings. It was a magic item, so it never needed it. "Well, that answers that question." Bernardo never mentioned who exactly was selling the food aid, but the answer seemed clear enough. Additionally, with the Holy Kingdom's royal army co-opting the grain, those profiting from the arrangement wouldn't be able to carry out their little scheme until the Holy Kingdom's wilderness campaign was over. By the time it was, the Sorceress Kingdom's intelligence division would have people in place to dispose of Bernardo and his associates. She wondered how many people involved in the scheme would die. Maybe she could watch. The men of the caravan smiled as Say welcomed the evening with a song. With the mystery of the grain shipments no longer nagging at her, she could now focus on her main target,